The alien marketplace was loud and full of life. Traders shouted the price of their goods. Buyers argued and bargained, pushing past each other to get the best deal. The smell of cooked meat mixed with the stench of rotting food. Bright banners waved above the stalls and the voices of merchants filled the air. But under all this noise, hidden at the edge of the market, there was a figure no one wanted to see. She was thin, too thin for any living being. Her skin clung tightly to her bones. Her clothes were nothing but torn rags, dirty and stiff from dust and sweat. Her eyes were dull and her lips cracked from thirst. She had not eaten properly in days. Every step she took shook her body, yet she kept moving, hoping to find something, anything that would keep her alive. The crowd noticed her, but not with kindness. Children pointed and laughed, adults sneered, and merchants shouted insults to chase her away. She reached toward a stall, her hand trembling as she tried to touch a small piece of fruit. The merchant slapped her hand back and threw the fruit on the ground. "Eat from the dirt, beggar!" he shouted, his voice filled with scorn. The crowd laughed. They clapped, whistled, and jeered. A few kicked the fruit farther away, enjoying her desperate crawl across the dirt. She reached for it, her body bending. Low, her knees scraping against the rough ground. Every movement was slow, as if her body no longer belonged to her. The people found it amusing. To them, she was not a living soul. She was entertainment. Among the crowd stood a man, silent and still. He was human, a stranger in this alien marketplace. His clothes were simple, his face tired, but his eyes were sharp. He watched everything. The way she crawled, the way the crowd mocked her, the way no one lifted a finger to help. His fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tightening. He had seen cruelty before, but this was different. The alien woman finally reached the fruit. She picked it up with shaking hands, dirt covering its skin. She brought it close to her lips, but before she could bite, another voice cut through the noise. "Look at her. She eats garbage." A stone flew from the crowd, striking her shoulder. She winced but held on to the fruit tightly. Another stone followed, then another. The crowd roared with laughter as she tried to protect herself with her weak arms. She was surrounded by cruelty. Every insult, every stone, every laugh was pushing her further toward despair. Still, she refused to let go of the fruit. Hunger was stronger than pain. Tears burned in her eyes, not just from the blows, but from the humiliation. She wished she could disappear, vanish into the ground, escape this endless suffering. The human's chest grew heavy. His heart pounded in anger. He had been told that life on this world was harsh, that the weak were cast aside, but seeing it with his own eyes was different. He wanted to look away, to leave, but he could not. His gaze was locked on her. He thought of the injustice, the cruelty of those who had everything and yet took pleasure in tormenting someone who had nothing. The woman tried to rise, clutching the fruit in her hand. Her legs shook, her body swayed, and for a moment it seemed she might stand. But her strength failed her. She collapsed, falling hard against the dirt. The fruit rolled from her fingers. Dust rose around her thin frame as the crowd shouted louder. Some shouted for the guards to drag her away. Others threw scraps of rotten food, laughing as they hit her face and body. She did not fight back. She did not even cry. She simply lay there, her breath shallow, her hands clutching her empty stomach. The human felt something break inside him. Every laugh around him echoed like a hammer against his mind. He could not understand how they could see a starving woman as a joke. He stepped forward, his boots pressing into the dirt. The crowd barely noticed him yet, their attention locked on their victim. But his steps were steady, his eyes burning with determination. The alien woman turned her head slightly, her weak eyes catching sight of the figure moving toward her. She thought it was another tormentor, another hand ready to strike her. She prepared herself for more pain. But there was something different in his face, something she had not seen in years. Pity, sorrow, and a strange kind of strength. The crowd laughed louder, calling for more fun. They expected her suffering to continue, but the human shadow fell across her body, blocking the light. And in that moment, the laughter began to fade, replaced by whispers of confusion. What was this stranger going to do? Why did he walk toward her when everyone else stayed back? The air grew heavy with silence, the kind of silence that comes before something no one expects. The woman's heart pounded weakly. She was sure this was her final moment. Yet in the depth of her despair, something was about to change. The silence in the market lasted only a moment. Then the crowd began to laugh again, louder than before. They thought the human was foolish for stepping forward. To them, helping a starving alien was weakness, even madness. A few shouted at him to move aside, to let the beggar die. Others smirked, waiting to see what he would do. But the human did not answer them. His eyes stayed fixed on the frail figure in the dirt. She tried to lift herself once more, her arms trembling, her breath shallow. Her ribs pushed against her thin skin, her body fighting for every bit of strength it no longer had. The fruit she had clung to rolled away from her, lost among the feet of the crowd. She reached for it, her fingers stretching weakly, but they could not touch it. Then her body gave out. Her arms collapsed, her legs folded beneath her, and she fell face first into the dirt. The sound was small, but it struck the human's ears like thunder. The laughter of the crowd became distant noise, meaningless compared to the sight before him. For the woman, everything turned blurry. The heat of the sun burned against her back, but she felt cold, so cold. Hunger was no longer just pain. It was emptiness, a hollow space where life used to be. She could hear the laughter around her, cruel and sharp, but it felt far away now. Her mind floated, her body refusing to obey. She thought this was the end. Perhaps it was better this way. Perhaps the suffering was finally over. But then a shadow fell across her again. A deep voice, calm but strong, cut through the jeers. Enough. The crowd grew quiet. Not fully silent, but uneasy. The human knelt beside her, ignoring the stares, ignoring the insults. He reached out carefully, his hand steady. For a moment she flinched. She expected another strike, another cruel push. But instead, his hand touched her shoulder gently, lifting her head from the dirt. Her eyes fluttered open. She saw him clearly, now, the stranger with tired eyes but a fire burning behind them. His face carried no mockery, no scorn, only concern. She could not understand it. Why would he care? No one ever had. The human pulled a small flask from his side. It was simple, battered from travel, but it held water. He tilted it toward her lips. At first she turned her head away, certain this was a trick. But thirst was stronger than fear. She parted her lips and cool water touched her tongue. It was like life itself flowing into her. She coughed, then swallowed, her throat aching, but desperate for more. The crowd murmured, some in disgust, others in disbelief. He's wasting it, someone spat. On her? On trash? Another laughed bitterly. Humans are fools, always trying to save what should be left to die. The human ignored them all. He gave her small sips, patient and calm, until her breathing grew steadier. Then he reached into his bag and pulled out a small piece of bread. Nothing fancy, but real food. He broke it into small parts, placing a piece in her trembling hand. Her fingers closed around it weakly. Tears filled her eyes. She stared at the bread as if it were a treasure, afraid it might vanish if she blinked. Slowly, she brought it to her lips and bit down. The taste was plain, yet to her it was sweeter than anything she had known. She chewed, slowly, her body almost too weak to swallow, but the human stayed with her, watching, waiting, protecting. Every eye in the market was on them. Some laughed harder, mocking him now instead of her. Others whispered, unsure of what to think. But none of it mattered to the human. His focus was on the frail woman who clung to life beside him. Her body leaned against his arm, too weak to hold itself. She wanted to speak, to ask why he was helping, but no words came. Only tears sliding down her dirt-stained cheeks. She had forgotten what kindness felt like. It was terrifying, and yet in that moment, it was the only thing keeping her alive. The human glanced up at the crowd, his eyes hard. If this is how you treat the helpless, he said quietly. Then perhaps the real trash is not her, but all of you. A hush fell. No one laughed now. Some looked away in shame. Others glared at him with anger, but none stepped closer. The human lifted the woman carefully, his arms steady despite her weightless frame. She gasped softly, unused to such gentleness. He stood tall, the alien woman held against his chest. The marketplace that had mocked her now stared in silence as the human began to walk. Each step was slow but firm, carrying her away from the cruelty, away from the laughter, towards something she had thought she would never know again: hope. Her head rested weakly against his shoulder. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe she might live another day. The market's laughter was gone. Only whispers remained, and with every step, the human's decision grew clearer. He would not abandon her. Not now, not ever. The human carried her through the narrow streets beyond the market. People stopped to stare, some whispering, others shaking their heads in disapproval. To them, she was a burden, a waste of food and effort. They had laughed when she starved, and now they mocked the man who chose to carry her. But he walked on, his grip steady, his eyes fixed ahead. The woman's body was light, far too light. Every bone pressed against his arms. She had lost so much strength that she could barely lift her head. Still, she opened her eyes enough to study his face. Why was he doing this? Why risk shame for someone like her? The question burned inside her, but her lips were too dry, too weak to form words. They reached a small house at the edge of the settlement. It was not large or fine, but it was solid, with walls that kept out the wind and a door that locked at night. The human pushed the door open with his foot and stepped inside. Warm light filled the room, and the smell of cooking herbs lingered in the air. He set her gently on a low bench near the fire. She flinched at first, expecting another cruel trick. Her body tensed, ready for a blow, but none came. Instead, he placed a blanket around her shoulders. It was rough but warm. She stared at it in disbelief, her hands clutching the fabric as if it might vanish. The human moved about the room with quiet purpose. He poured water into a cup, broke a small loaf of bread, and cut pieces of dried meat. When he placed the food before her, her hands trembled so badly she could barely lift it. He helped guide the cup to her lips, steadying her shaking fingers. At first she ate slowly, nibbling like a frightened animal, but hunger was stronger than fear. Soon she took larger bites, her eyes wet with tears as she tasted food not spoiled, not thrown at her like garbage, but given freely. Her chest ached, not from pain, but from something she thought she had forgotten: dignity. The human watched her in silence, letting her eat at her own pace. When she finally leaned back, too full to continue, her breathing slowed. For the first time in years, she felt warmth in her belly. Her eyes closed for a moment, but she forced them open. She could not sleep. Not yet. Not until she understood. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "Why?" The human looked at her, his face calm. "Because you needed help." Tears spilled down her cheeks. The answer was simple, too simple. No one else had thought so. No one else had cared. She wanted to believe him, yet part of her heart feared it was a lie. Trust was dangerous. Trust had led her into pain before. But his eyes were steady, and his voice carried no mockery. He sat across from her, leaning forward slightly. "No one deserves to starve," he said. "Not while I still have food to share." She lowered her gaze, unable to meet his eyes. Shame burned inside her. She was nothing, unwanted, discarded by her own people. Yet here sat a stranger, a human, offering her food, shelter, and kindness. She wanted to speak again, but the words tangled in her throat. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the sounds of the market faded into the distance. For the first time in years, silence felt safe. The blanket around her shoulders grew warmer, and her body began to relax. The human stood and moved toward a small chest. He pulled out another blanket and spread it across a simple bed in the corner. Then he turned to her. "You should rest. You're safe here." Her heart raced at the word safe. She had forgotten what it meant. Still, suspicion lingered. Could this be another trap? Could he throw her out once she was strong enough to walk? She searched his face for any sign of cruelty, but there was none. Only calm determination. Slowly, she allowed him to guide her toward the bed. Her legs shook, barely holding her weight, but he supported her gently. When she sank into the bed, the softness beneath her felt unreal. Her eyes widened. She had not touched a bed in years. He pulled the blanket up to her chin. Rest. Tomorrow will be better. Her chest tightened. She wanted to thank him, but exhaustion pulled her down. Her eyes fluttered shut, tears still wet on her cheeks. She had come to the market to beg for scraps and thought she would die in the dirt. Now she lay in a warm bed, her stomach full, covered by a blanket, safe under the roof of a human who owed her nothing. As she drifted into sleep, one thought echoed in her mind. Perhaps not all hope was lost. The human sat quietly by the fire, watching the flames. He knew the days ahead would not be easy. The neighbors would whisper, the traders would laugh. But he did not care. He had made his choice. He had invited her into his home, and he would not turn back. Outside, the night grew darker. Inside, a fragile spark of trust began to burn. Morning light slipped through the cracks of the shutters, casting thin lines across the small room. The woman stirred under the blanket, her body still weak but warmer than it had been in months. For a moment she thought it was a dream. The bed beneath her was soft, the air smelled of clean wood and herbs, and no one was laughing at her. But when she opened her eyes, she saw the human sitting by the table, sharpening a small blade. The sound was steady, calm, not threatening. She froze. Memories rushed back, being mocked, starved, treated as less than nothing. Her heart pounded. Yet the human turned his head and gave a nod, not of command, but of greeting. "You're awake," he said simply. His voice carried no sharpness, only quiet strength. She sat up slowly, her arms still weak. The blanket slipped down her shoulders, and she clutched it close as if afraid it might be taken away. The human stood and poured water into a cup, then handed it to her. She hesitated before taking it, her eyes studying his face carefully. There was no sign of trickery, no hidden smirk, only patience. She drank. The water cooled her dry throat, and she sighed softly, as if life itself was seeping back in. A small meal was already set on the table: bread, boiled roots, and dried meat. Nothing rich, but more than she had seen in months. He gestured for her to join. Her legs shook when she tried to stand, so he guided her with a steady arm. She sat staring at the food. Her stomach growled, yet her hands shook too much to lift the bread. He noticed, but he did not mock. Instead, he broke the bread into smaller pieces and placed them before her. She ate in silence, each bite tasting like a miracle. Tears pricked her eyes, not just from hunger, but from the memory of being spat on for daring to eat before. Here she was not insulted. Here she was allowed. The human ate with her, slow and calm, making sure she did not feel watched like an animal. When the meal was done, he cleared the table without a word. She leaned back, her body still trembling with weakness, but something inside her had changed. For the first time, her stomach was not empty, and her body was not shaking from cold. The human stepped outside to chop wood. She sat by the window, pulling the blanket tighter around her. From the small gap, she saw the neighbors across the street. They pointed at the human, whispering to one another, their faces full of contempt. She knew why. They thought he was a fool. Taking her in was shameful. To them, she was less than dirt. Her chest tightened with guilt. She had brought him trouble just by existing under his roof. Part of her wanted to run, to save him from the judgment of his people. But when he returned with an armful of wood, his expression was calm, unbothered. He stacked the logs neatly and looked at her with the same steady eyes as before. "This is your place now," he said. Her lips parted in shock. "Your place." No one had ever spoken those words to her. She had no place. She had been thrown aside, unwanted by all, and now, this human, a stranger, claimed she belonged here. Her throat tightened, and she lowered her gaze, unable to answer. But in her chest, something fragile flickered, a spark of belonging. As the day passed, she watched him move about the house. He worked with his hands, fixing a broken chair, tending to the fire, and preparing food for the evening. He did not speak much, but his silence was not heavy. It was peaceful. She found herself breathing easier in the quiet. That night, when he placed another blanket near the fire for himself, she frowned. "You bed?" she whispered, pointing to the corner where she had slept. He shook his head. "You need it more." Her eyes filled with tears again. She turned away quickly, ashamed to show weakness. But her heart ached with something she had forgotten long ago: gratitude. Outside, whispers grew louder. Neighbors mocked him for wasting food and shelter on trash. But inside, walls kept the cruelty away. Inside, for the first time in her life, she felt safe. She lay awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling. Her body was still frail, her heart still scarred, but one truth burned inside her. She had been given more than food, more than shelter. She had been given dignity. The human slept by the fire, steady breaths filling the room. She listened to that sound, and for the first time in years, she believed she might have a future. Tomorrow would not be easy. The world outside would not forgive. But tonight in this shelter, she was no longer dying. She was alive. And for the first time, she dared to dream of tomorrow. Days passed and the woman grew stronger. Her cheeks no longer looked hollow. Her hands no longer shook when she lifted food. Her eyes, once dull and lifeless, now carried a faint glow of hope. She could walk around the small house slowly, though her legs still trembled at times. Each day she whispered quiet thanks to the human who had taken her in. But outside those walls, not everyone shared her gratitude. The market was alive with talk. Whispers carried through the stalls and streets. People shook their heads, pointing toward the human's house. "He wastes food on her," some said. "A beggar, a castaway, not worth saving." Others scoffed louder. "Humans are strange, always thinking with their hearts instead of their minds. He will regret it." The cruelest ones laughed and muttered that she should have been left to die. These whispers soon turned to jeers. Whenever the human walked to the market, voices followed him. "How's your pet?" a merchant sneered. "Does she beg at your table too?" Another tossed spoiled fruit at his feet. "Feed her this. She's used to garbage." Laughter echoed, but the human never answered. He picked up what he needed and walked away, his steps calm, his silence heavier than any reply. Inside the house, the woman heard pieces of their words. Neighbors passing by spoke loud enough for her to understand. Shame burned inside her. She wanted to disappear, to stop being the reason he faced mockery. But every time she looked at him, his face carried no regret, only quiet strength. He never spoke of the whispers, never complained, never asked her to leave. His silence told her more than words could. He had chosen this path and he would not turn back. Still, the weight of their hatred pressed on her heart. At night, she sat by the fire while he slept, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Why does he risk himself for me?" she thought. "Why fight the world for someone who was left to die?" She did not have the answer, and fear whispered that one day the burden would be too heavy even for him. One morning, while he chopped wood outside, a group of neighbors gathered near the fence. Their voices were sharp, meant to cut. "Human, send her away," one shouted. "She will drain you dry." Another added, "Do not shame yourself further. She is nothing." Their words struck like stones. The woman sat frozen inside, her chest tight. She waited for his reply, for his voice to falter, but he straightened, axe resting against the woodpile. His eyes scanned the small crowd. "Nothing," he said, his tone calm but edged with steel. "You laugh while someone starves, and you call her nothing. If that is how you measure worth, then it is you who are nothing." His voice was not loud, but it carried, heavy and firm. The neighbors shifted uneasily, their smirks fading. The woman's hands clutched the blanket around her shoulders. Tears blurred her vision. For the first time, someone had spoken for her, not against her. He had stood before many and chosen her side. It felt unreal, like a dream she was afraid to wake from. The whispers did not stop. If anything, they grew sharper, carried with more bitterness. Yet slowly others began to watch more carefully. Some who had laughed before now grew quiet. They saw her walk with more strength, her face brighter, her body healing. They saw how the human carried himself, not with shame, but with pride. Doubt began to grow in their hearts. One evening, as the fire burned low, she turned to him. Her voice trembled but carried determination. "They hate me. They hate you for me. You could send me away. It would be easier." He looked at her, his eyes steady. Easier does not mean right. She lowered her gaze, her chest aching with emotion. No one had ever chosen her over themselves. Yet here he was, holding to his choice with the strength of stone. That night, she lay awake, staring at the roof. The whispers outside had not ended, but inside her heart something shifted. She was no longer only a victim, no longer only a shadow crawling in the dirt. She was someone worth protecting, someone worth speaking for. The human had given her food, water, and shelter. But now he had given her something greater, dignity against the crowd. And as she closed her eyes, she realized the whispers no longer cut as deep. Because one voice, his voice, had spoken louder than them all. The days stretched into weeks, and though the whispers outside had not faded, something new was taking shape inside the human's small house. The woman was no longer the trembling shadow he had carried from the dirt. Her steps grew stronger, her eyes brighter. She could move about without his arm holding her steady. Every sunrise felt like a small victory, every meal a reminder that she was still alive. Yet what truly changed her was not just food or shelter. It was him, the human. He did not treat her as a burden. He spoke to her as though she mattered, as though her thoughts carried weight. When she struggled to form words, he listened patiently. When she doubted herself, his silence gave comfort, as if his very presence was proof she was not alone. One evening, she sat by the fire sewing torn fabric into a patch for his cloak. Her fingers moved clumsily, but she was determined. He watched, quietly, his lips curving into the faintest smile. When she handed the cloak back, ashamed at the crooked stitches, he placed it over his shoulders without hesitation. "It's stronger now," he said simply. Her heart swelled, for no one had ever worn something she touched with pride. They began to share more of themselves. She told him, in broken words, of her past, how her own people had cast her out, how hunger had gnawed at her body while laughter stabbed at her spirit. She expected judgment, maybe even pity, but he only listened, his eyes steady, his jaw tight with anger at the cruelty she had faced. "You were not trash," he said, "they were blind." She had no words to answer. Tears spilled silently down her cheeks, not of pain this time, but of healing. The bond between them grew in small ways. She began to help with simple tasks, carrying water, cutting vegetables, sweeping the floor. Every act felt like proof she belonged. And though the world outside still whispered, inside the house there was peace. But peace came at a cost. One afternoon, while they worked in the small garden behind the house, a group of men stopped at the fence. Their voices carried sharp edges. "Human, you shame us with your charity," one sneered. "You feed her, clothe her, and for what? She will only drag you down." The woman froze, her hands gripping the handle of the watering jug. Her heart sank. She could not bear for him to hear such words again. She waited for his anger, for the weight of their cruelty to finally break him. But he stood tall, his back straight, his voice calm. "She is not a burden," he said. "She is my guest. My house is my choice." The men muttered curses and walked away, their threats hanging in the air. The woman's eyes filled with tears. She set down the jug and turned to him. "Why? Why stand for me?" she asked, her voice shaking. He looked at her with quiet certainty. Because I see you, and I will not let you fall again. Her chest ached, her breath caught. Those words struck deeper than any cruelty she had endured. No one had ever said she was worth standing for. No one had ever chosen her side so completely. In that moment, something shifted inside her. Gratitude burned into loyalty, sorrow turned into hope. She realized she no longer wanted only to survive. She wanted to live, and she wanted to live beside him. That night, as the firelight flickered across the room, she whispered softly, "I owe you my life." He shook his head. "You owe me nothing. Live. That is enough." She lay awake long after he slept, staring at the ceiling. Her mind raced with thoughts she had never dared to imagine before. For the first time, she felt the future could be more than suffering, more than loneliness. For the first time, she felt she had someone who would not abandon her. And slowly the bond between them grew into something unspoken, something stronger than the whispers outside. It was not built on pity, nor on need, but on choice. He had chosen to save her, and now she chose to stand by him. The world still mocked, still whispered. But together, they no longer seemed so loud. The whispers had turned into open scorn. Each day the human walked into the market, voices followed him like a shadow. They laughed at him for protecting her. They mocked her whenever she stepped outside, though weaker now, their cruelty still sharp. Some even threatened him openly. "She will ruin you," they said, "and when she does, no one will save you." But the human never bent, never turned his back. And because of that, she too began to stand taller. The woman who once crawled in the dirt now walked beside him, her thin body filling with strength, her eyes shining with quiet fire. She still remembered every insult, every stone thrown, but now she faced the world not as prey, but as someone who had been given back her dignity. One morning they walked together through the same marketplace where she had once starved. Heads turned, whispers rose, but she did not lower her gaze. She walked at the human side, her steps steady, her shoulders no longer bent with shame. The crowd that had mocked her before fell into uneasy silence. They had expected her to remain broken. They had expected the human to give up. But instead, here they were side by side, unshaken. A merchant sneered, tossing a rotten apple at their feet. "Look at them, trash and fool together." Laughter broke out, but it was weaker now, uncertain. The human turned, his eyes cold. He picked up the apple, placed it back on the merchant's stall, and said quietly, "The only trash here is cruelty." His voice cut sharper than any blade. The laughter died. The woman felt her heart race. Every step they took together was an act of defiance, a challenge to the world that had cast her aside. She no longer felt like a shadow. She felt seen, chosen. But the real test came that evening. A group gathered outside the human's house, voices loud, fists pounding on the door. "Send her out," they demanded. "She has no place here." Their shouts echoed through the night, growing louder, more hateful. The woman trembled inside, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. She looked at him with fear. "They will hurt you because of me," she whispered. The human stood firm. He opened the door, stepping out into the crowd. The woman gasped, fear burning in her chest, but she could not look away. The men outside sneered, their eyes filled with contempt. "Why protect her?" one demanded. "She is worthless. She was meant to die in the dirt." The human's voice was steady, unshaken. "No life is worthless," he said. "Not hers, not anyone's. You may laugh at kindness, you may mock compassion, but you cannot erase it. She lives because I chose to help, and I will never regret that choice." The crowd grew restless. Some muttered curses, but others shifted uncomfortably. Doubt flickered in their eyes. His words carried a weight they could not deny. For years they had laughed at her suffering. For years they had told themselves she deserved it. But now, seeing her alive, standing behind him, the lie began to break. The woman stepped forward, her voice weak but clear. "You called me nothing. You left me to starve. Yet I live. I live because one human saw me when none of you did. If that makes him a fool, then I would rather walk with a fool than crawl among the blind." Her words struck the air like fire. The crowd fell silent. Some looked away in shame, others scowled, but no one dared to laugh. The defiance in her voice, the strength in her stance made their cruelty feel small. The human placed a hand on her shoulder, steady and firm. Together they faced the crowd, not as savior and victim, but as equals. The marketplace that had once been a stage for her humiliation now stood as witness to her rebirth. Slowly the crowd broke apart. Some left muttering, others in silence. No one dared to throw stones. No one dared to laugh. For the first time she walked through them without fear. That night, as they sat by the fire, she looked at him with tears in her eyes. "You gave me more than food," she whispered. "You gave me life." He shook his head gently. "You found the strength yourself. I only reminded you it was there." She smiled faintly, her heart heavy with gratitude and something deeper she could not name. The bond between them had grown stronger than any insult, any threat. They had faced the cruelty of the world together, and together they had won. The whispers outside would not end forever. Cruelty always found new ways to speak, but she knew now that she was not alone. She had someone who saw her worth when no one else did. And because of that, she would never again bow her head in shame. The fire burned low, casting warm light across their faces. Outside, the night was quiet. Inside, there was peace. And in that peace, the woman who had once been left to die now lived with a strength that no laughter, no cruelty could ever take away.